My name is Igor, I'm an enterprise account manager, and today I'm joined by not just one, but two guests who together carried out a system transformation that was truly remarkable. From time pressure and technical challenges to the best learnings, today we'll definitely be able to take away a lot from Dominik Sommer of Miles & More and Deml from LPS. With that in mind, hello to both of you. It's great that you're here.
Hi, Igor. Greetings.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Chris. Hi, Igor.
Let's briefly introduce ourselves so that all listeners know who they are dealing with. Chris, would you like to start?
Yes, that's right. I'm Chris. I'm a solutions architect at LPS in Munich, have been working there for over 10 years, and most of that time for my favorite client, Miles & More.
That's a good segue straight over to Dominik.
What am I supposed to say after that, Chris?
Set the bar high.
Indeed, exactly. Yes, Dominik Sommer, I've been with Miles & More for almost 10 years now. I also started there as an architect, and that's when I got to know Chris. We have a long shared history, which is why I think we're very familiar with each other. I then built up the IT platform team at Miles & More and have now been responsible for IT and product development for almost 5 years. In that capacity, I'm also, so to speak, the sponsor of our joint project.
So basically a well-coordinated team. Now you've already touched on the joint project. Dominik, would you like to tell the listeners, maybe explain what this is all about?
With pleasure. Maybe just a bit more context. I think Miles & More is a familiar name to many out there. We are Europe's largest frequent flyer program, or travel loyalty program, however you want to define it, with over 30 million participants. And what we have done together is to migrate our core system, which is called Samba, from an on-premise hosting environment to a cloud environment at AWS.
Great, thank you, Dominik. Chris, can you also tell us something about it?
I had the opportunity to help with the implementation. We had some requirements within LPS for how we should do this. And I think in the end, we managed to do it very successfully. But exactly how, we'll find out as we continue with this podcast.
What I would especially like to know now is, typically you hear from customers, never change a running system. And Dominik, you said that your Samba initiative was actually already running. So how did it even come about, if I may ask? A question for Chris and Dominik. What led to the decision to migrate everything to the cloud?
There were various triggers for this. Maybe a bit more background on that as well. We've been working with the Samba system for about 15 years now, which is based on a standard product from LPS called the Loyalty Management System. And of course, over the past 15 years, we've massively adapted it to our needs because in the situation of a frequent flyer program of a large airline group, we certainly have requirements that you might not necessarily build into a standard product on the market, would implement. And in that respect, it's like with all software developments that run over a longer period of time, over the years, you do accumulate a bit of baggage. So one of the objectives was to say we need to start a technical modernization anyway. So let's also take another look at the hosting after we've reviewed the operating environment. And on top of that, we had an immediate time-sensitive factor, the fact that the data center where our infrastructure was located was scheduled to be decommissioned as planned. That means literally power off, all servers out, and then the building would be used for something else. So we had the necessity to think about this. And of course, we would have had the option to say, we'll just continue as before in another data center. But since we were already engaged in modernization activities, on the other hand, we decided to take the right step and carry out the modernization at this point so that we use more cloud-native components or rely more natively on cloud technologies. This way, we avoid the classic lift and shift problem where we would just have the same thing we had on premises, simply in the cloud, without benefiting from the advantages the cloud offers, such as elasticity, scaling options, and so on. We wanted to take advantage of that at the same time, and that's why we said we're going directly into the cloud. Okay.
So I've heard about several challenges, both from the lift and shift approach and from the deadlines. Shall we start with
Lift and shift part on?
Why did you decide against simply migrating from on-premises to the cloud, but instead opted for direct integration with the LPS platform?
The LPS platform has always been the foundation of Samba. So the real question was, where do we operate it if the data center closes? And as I said, the hope we placed in this was that by moving from a legacy application server structure from an infrastructure or architecture that was very much driven by an on-premises database, and to say, we want to run the whole thing in the cloud, that would have, as we once calculated, Chris, if I remember correctly, turned out to be quite expensive if we simply tried to lift an on-premises optimized software architecture over as is. Moving it into a cloud environment would have cost us more money, and we wouldn't have been able to take advantage of the benefits that the cloud offers. And that's why we said the advantages we see in the cloud, specifically two. Even really simple things like when we quickly need a test or development environment, I can just spin that up in the cloud. And for me, it's only needed for an hour. But also things like performance. If I have peaks in load, I can quickly scale up. I can do rolling deployments without outages. So there are various advantages that I simply have in an environment where more computing power is available on demand. And these are exactly the things we wanted to focus on moving forward to ensure we remain future-proof.
Maybe I could go a bit deeper into the technical details. Our old platform was very much driven by Oracle, and of course there are certain licensing costs that you inevitably face with on-premise solutions. And that would probably have become even worse in the cloud. That was also one of the reasons why we phased out those components. And if you're already becoming more lightweight in terms of database and application server, the idea back then was actually to switch to Spring Boot. Then it makes sense to also take advantage of modern cluster environments like Kubernetes and to switch to containers. And then it was actually pretty clear that we would do all of this at once. Some of you may have already done a similar project. When you create a hub, invest accordingly, and then reach a point where everything basically works, then it's always very difficult to set up a second hub. At least from my perspective, that was another reason why we said we'd do it all at once.
Earlier, you also mentioned the tough deadlines, Dominik. I can imagine that this is especially challenging in a project of this size. How did this time pressure affect the project planning?
I think the biggest impact was, of course, that we had a very strict end date. It was clear to everyone from the start that by the deadline, when the data center goes dark and the power is switched off, so we really had to be physically finished by then. Otherwise, we would be offline with Samba, and as I said, that's essentially our core banking system, if you will, where all our customer data, their miles, accounts, and all transactions are processed. If that's not available, then from that day on, basically nothing related to miles and more will work anymore. So in that respect, that was definitely the clear constraint that was there from the very beginning. The difficulty we had, to be honest, was that, as I briefly mentioned earlier, because the system had grown over the years, you naturally don't have complete transparency from the start about how big the task actually is. That means the number of unknown unknowns was relatively high at the beginning. And so we said, well, so on the one hand, because of that, and on the other hand, because both Chris and I think, are a bit agile at heart, we said, well, it's obvious. We'll approach this as an agile project and try to develop iteratively so that we always have a clear understanding at each point in time of what the next right and important things to do are. And to have the freedom that, by design, it's set up so that when we turn an unknown into a known, when we discover something new, we can, by design, respond and say, now we'll do the next thing that currently proves to be the right step, without having to start negotiating change requests within a classic project structure. By the way, this also applies to the contractual situation between our two companies. That's why we said we'll set this up from the very beginning. We'll take an agile approach, manage it together, make decisions about what has priority together, and then rely on the time we have until the cutover being sufficient. Of course, we took a closer look at this beforehand. It's not like we went into this completely blind and naive. But that was the approach to say, we don't know everything exactly along the way. We're going to encounter a lot of things along the way and learn. We have to respond to that. And that's what we tried to take into account with this agile approach. Chris might be able to add a bit more about the safety nets we built in, so to speak.
In my opinion, this agile approach was the most important thing, or really the only thing we could do at that moment, because the tight time frame, a long classic waterfall analysis phase, figuring out exactly what needed to be done, simply wasn't possible until the end. We just had to get started right away. There were enough things we knew had to be done. We tackled those immediately. While we were implementing those, we came up with additional things. Those were the known unknowns that we learned about. And as we learned about the known unknowns, we also discovered the unknown unknowns. At the same time, we kept setting milestones for ourselves where we could track progress in a certain way and also create a safety net by saying, okay, by this or that point, this needs to be done, and it needs to work. By this or that point, we need to know this or that. And then, well, in the agile world, that's a hard deadline. The only way to manage it is by constantly reviewing the scope and checking, okay, what do I really need now and what don't I need? And I think that's what ultimately made the project a success.
Chris, now, Dominik mentioned that you already know each other well from the past and that the collaboration comes from previous experience. Did everything work out the way you had planned in advance, or did you have to make compromises, especially with this really tough deadline?
Yes, unfortunately we did. I had hinted at it briefly before. Actually, the target architecture was to completely remove all JE technologies from the stack and switch to Spring Boot. We realized relatively quickly that the dependencies were so extensive that it would be easier to use an interim scenario. So instead of WebLogic, simply use a free application server, a much more lightweight application server. And that was actually a decision we made after just 2 months or so, that we had to do it that way. And as a result, for example, we didn't replace the batch framework we used to import and export all our files with a new one, but instead stuck with the old one. Those were the bitter pills we had to swallow relatively early on.
Yes, I might add that besides the technical aspects, of course, we also had milestones and a safety net on a sort of, as you hinted at a bit, Chris, decision gate basis, where we said that by a certain point in time, for example, the entire functional scope had to be fully migrated and testable. Honestly, we weren't able to meet that milestone, which then led us to say, okay, we actually need to postpone our cutover date again. And we also need to think about a plan B or a plan C. In any case, we needed to start the mitigating actions, so to speak. And those were certainly things that benefited us in our approach. And that's exactly why we set things up the way we did, so that we would have these options to be able to navigate and along the way to ask ourselves if we are on track. So in our burn down charts, are we on the right path? Are we going to end up where we need to be? And if not, then we really need to react or take action.
Absolutely. It was always necessary to have a plan B. For a long time, plan B was that we might be able to extend the contract with the on-premise service provider a bit longer. At some point, that option fell away, and then it was clear, okay, without a plan B, proceeding in this agile way, management wouldn't approve of that in the long run, which is why, during the critical phase, we actually worked on an additional plan B. And I think that was a good thing, because you can probably imagine how much is connected to such a large system and what would happen if it simply wasn't there anymore.
I think we had a good approach, and we also knew what we would do if things actually went wrong. Something that might also be interesting for the listeners out there, I mentioned it a bit earlier, Samba is actually an account management system, which is why I tend to use this common term, core banking system. That means transactions are recorded there, in our case not euro transactions, but mileage transactions. And once I've done a cutover, I can only roll back to a limited extent. That means the moment I have migrated the data and then start processing transactions in the new environment and in the new database. I can't just say that I'll simply roll it back. If someone has spent their miles and booked an award flight or bought a suitcase in the World Shop, I can't just say I'll roll back that transaction because there are actually dependent transactions linked to it. That was another constraint we had to take into account. We had to be sure enough to say that at the moment we dared to make the cutover, there would be no turning back. At least it would have been very, very difficult. That's why from the very beginning, we said that we would focus on generating as much confidence as possible so that at the moment of the cutover, we would know exactly what would happen if we did it, and that we would have a very high level of security because we had already prepared everything in advance and tested it in the live environment. Just so we would know that when we flip the switch, there might still be a few bumps here and there. But that the system basically holds up, that it fundamentally does what it's supposed to do, that there are no obvious errors left in it. That's what we had already tested thoroughly in advance.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, this is a mammoth project that you have put together, and it absolutely has to be ensured that, especially with such a hard deadline, the preceding steps work, knowing, as you said, that there are known unknowns. What I would be interested to know is, in order to handle all this, you weren't just the two of you, but you certainly had an appropriate team. How did this trio, consisting of at least 3 companies, affect the collaboration? Or rather, how did you actually utilize these different areas of expertise?
Yes, you're bringing up an important point, Igor, but I'd like to briefly go back to Dominik. We actually achieved this level of quality by quickly trying to get a productive environment up and running. That was actually a recommendation from a highly respected AWS colleague, Matthias Patzak, who said, yes, just do it like this. First, set up the production line. Try to get traffic on the new production as quickly as possible to see whether it works, whether it doesn't, what latencies there are, how it functions, and so on. And that helped us a lot to have a very good feeling quite early on that, at least technically, in terms of performance and stability, there wouldn't be any problems. And secondly, of course, we had to learn a lot during that time, we as LPS employees. And there were actually two things that helped us there. On the one hand, bringing in experts, for example, from the company ThoughtWorks or also from AWS Professional Services. And secondly, to bring these experts together in a highly focused way. And there, on the advice of AWS, we also attended an EBA workshop, which for me as a layperson basically means lock the best people you have in a room together for a week, focused entirely on specific topics. Prepare it so well. The point is to make sure that people can work together as smoothly as possible during that week. And as a mechanism, that was simply a learning experience for us, not just in EBA where we made incredible progress, not only in terms of implementation, but also in terms of learning. But we also kept doing this within the LPS, so to speak, introducing these short sprints by booking a large space, gathering together, dedicating ourselves, preparing for what would happen during that week, and then pushing through it together. And for me, that was truly a fascinating experience. The kind of speed you can achieve there. Yes, it's a bit like a rocket launch control center. Yes, things really move forward there.
I'm sure our colleague Patsak will be happy to hear that. But just to clarify regarding the Experienced Base Acceleration Workshop, or IBA for short, of course it sounded rather draconian to lock people in like that. But based on experience, I can really only confirm that this concentrated and focused work during the sprint truly works wonders as long as you don't let yourself get distracted, so to speak, and really focus on just one thing for an extended period. But thank you in any case for the compliment at this point. To perhaps back this up with some numbers, we're talking about millions of customer records that had to be migrated. How did you manage to do that?
As I already mentioned, we actually used these already established production environments. And there we had already started migrating the data well in advance using AWS DMS, that is, with this data migration service. This means that months before the go live, we had already performed a complete extraction of the data through an initial load. And we had a continuously running delta load of the real data from the old system into the new system. That means during the cutover itself, we only had to switch over. And yes, exactly.
What was always quite exciting about this approach, of course, was that on the one hand, we continuously ran the migration as a data load, but we also tested 2 or 3 times what it would actually be like if we migrated all the data at once. We realized that if we wanted to do a cutover, the initial estimate was something like 3 or 4 days of downtime, right, Chris? I don't even remember exactly anymore.
Yes, the issue was that while the data was migrated, constraints, foreign keys, etc., had to be recreated, and you only want to do that once. And of course, it would have taken several hours if we had done it on the fly.
So by setting up the production environment in advance, testing the data migration multiple times beforehand, checking the delta loads, and also figuring out when, I think the trick was that we actually disabled live indexing during the import. And then we basically said, first let the migration run through, and then build the indexes afterwards. That, of course, also saved us a bit more cycle time, so to speak. And naturally, at the end of the day, it contributed to us being able to carry out the cutover very quickly, in an organized manner.
Ah, yes, exactly. There was also the tweak to move away from the originally planned to reduce the actual downtime from 6 to 7 hours to just 1 hour or even less. We kept the old system running as a read-only version throughout the entire cutover, except for those 60 minutes I mentioned earlier. That means customers who only access the system in read-only mode, for example, logging in, viewing their profile, checking if their miles had already been credited, and so on. All of this standard functionality was already working during that time, even though we had technically already taken the system offline.
Just to clarify, the cutover lasted about 7 hours and only 60 minutes were actually inaccessible. How did you manage to achieve such minimal downtime, and which main steps can you, or are you allowed to, share with the listeners? Or are you allowed to share with the listeners?
Well, on the one hand, it was preparation and a phased plan, having as much as possible already in production and tested before the cutover. That was one aspect, especially given the sheer volume of data. And the second part was practicing this cutover on other environments beforehand. And to know exactly down to the minute, or actually even to the second, who needs to do what, when, and where. And to keep optimizing that, trying to do as many things in parallel as possible. And that's how we managed to optimize it down to these 60 minutes.
Parallel and coordinated, that sounds like the most important elements if I'm hearing you right. But what is especially important there, and how many people from your teams were actually involved?
Doesn't know exactly during the cutover. I would say that we actually started the cutover ourselves at around 9 p.m. on that day with 5 or 6 people, and then depending on what the plan called for, people joined or left. In the end, we went live for the first time at around 1 or 1:30 a.m. Then there was still some follow-up work to do. I would say overall there were always 7 or 8 people involved in carrying out the tasks.
When you consider everything that was involved, that's a manageable number of people. But I mean, hey, your success proves you right. Earlier you said an important sentence that stuck with me. Never underestimate the complexity of network connectivity within a global corporation. Do you have an example from the migration process that fits this?
One major challenge indeed is that if you consider Samba, as I said, as a kind of core banking system, then of course it inherently has core banking functionality. But in reality, many of these essential functionalities actually come from the complex process of connecting various backend systems that specifically carry out and manage all of these individual bookings. And this all runs over various types of network connections, both within the Lufthansa Group and to affiliated partner airlines, Star Alliance Airlines, and a whole host of other partners that we have connected. And the overall complexity behind this, with the various routes that such network connections have to, can, or should take, whether for security reasons or practical application reasons, has really been a major issue, figuring out how we can manage this entire list. Connections were carefully established, fully aware that there were significantly more than 100 connections involved, each with its own particular characteristics. This is a level of complexity that simply takes a lot of time, because each of these connections has to be examined individually and coordinated with a wide variety of people. That was actually one of the bigger technical challenges we faced at that point. And I think it's also one of the lessons learned, Chris, about how we would approach this going forward.
Maybe let's look at a concrete example now, using a technical scenario. In this old on-premise world, or in the classic networking world, you talk a lot about specific IP addresses, IP ranges, and so on. When you work with cloud systems, it's all about naming services. That means the IP addresses that are assigned are, in 99% of cases, assigned dynamically from the range that is currently available. And that means if you have a system like Samba with its 200 interfaces, sometimes deeply integrated into partner systems, into miles and more, but also deep within the Lufthansa Group, then it means that things that used to be hardwired and suddenly stop working because of certain IP addresses or IP address ranges. That means that all the firewalls stop working, because these firewalls are, of course, always tweaked for security reasons, so that only the bare minimum of what might be needed is actually open. And that approach simply doesn't work, or only works differently, or only with considerable effort. And that's the point where I would say I personally think I underestimated it a bit. Others in our company had already predicted this and said, Chris, start with that, it's going to be the worst part. And I always thought, guys, pulling a cable can't be that hard. But it is.
And once the cable is in place, Chris, so if we work our way up the OSI layers, that means if I've somehow managed to establish at least layer 4 connectivity with the firewalls, then you get fun things like DNS. And some people then don't use static IPs after all, but DNS instead. Then the question is, on which DNS server do I configure which private IPs? And once I've managed that, then at some point even higher up in the OSI model, or in a similar category, the whole topic of SSL certificates comes up, because those can also be set up in various ways and need to be properly installed. So in that respect, yes, the whole list is, I think, a major learning experience. For those of you listening who have faced similar challenges, make sure to put this right at the top of your project plan, because the dangerous, or rather tragic, realization is that if I have a bug in the application, I can always work around it a bit, work some magic. But if I don't have a connection, the whole thing comes to a halt, and it stays that way until the connection is established. Only after that can I continue with functional testing. So that's definitely a major issue in such complex migrations.
Now, you have been successful, and that's something you often hear in IT as well, or when you're presenting the project to your supervisor, for example, that it's better to have a plan B in case something doesn't work right away as it should. Especially fixed IP addresses or name server issues typically can't be solved with the initial plan. Were there situations in the project where you had to switch to alternative solutions?
Yes, there were actually two moments. One moment was when we had to deviate from the basic architecture. That happened quite early on. And a second moment was when we at least extend the point in time when the data center would be shut down a little bit longer. At some point, we had a deadline set for February. We were at least able to push that back to the end of March. That was a plan B, but then that plan B was no longer available. And that's why, for me, this is always a lesson learned. If you have such a hard deadline at the end, then it's essential to also have a plan C. And plan C should evolve along with the project. The higher the confidence, the less effort I put into actually implementing it. And if you start to feel a bit uncertain, then you should perhaps balance things out by investing in it as well, so that you can also activate plan C if needed. It's one thing to have a plan in your head, but it's another to actually be able to flip the switch and put it into action. Fortunately, we didn't have to resort to our plan C, but I think it helped all of us sleep a little better knowing we had it. Even if it was just driving there with a big delivery van, picking up the computers and putting them somewhere else, in a room that was at least somewhat air-conditioned, that would have been the absolute worst-case scenario.
Let me just summarize real quick. Project accomplished, migration completed, time to take a breather. But what about the future? Do you still have plans for things you might want to do?
Exactly, I was about to say something along those lines. This move from Samba to the cloud was one element. Admittedly, it was also a very crucial and major one on our entire modernization roadmap. So there were activities before this, as Chris hinted at, to change the application architecture, meaning to upgrade technical components like the application server and database technologies to a new level. But of course, we also have further plans such as stronger modularization, looking again at how we can improve our time to market, also by leveraging the new capabilities in the cloud, using cloud-native components and things like that, but honestly also more mundane things like cost optimization. So a cloud environment, if you just go in there bare bones, when you first go in, you play it safe at first, logically. You want to make sure above all that everything runs smoothly, but of course there are still plenty of things we can optimize accordingly.
Very good. But now to finish, one cheeky question. Did you actually have fun? That
is a mean question. Well, afterwards, when it worked out, of course it was always fun. Looking back on it, in the moment though, when you're right in the middle of it, and then you say, hey, I actually had to promise the board of a corporation at that point to say, hey, we're doing this migration and there's no turning back. So at the moment when we flipped the switch, as I just said, it had to work. We were going to find a few things that probably wouldn't work. And that's exactly how it turned out. Thank God, just as we had planned, or well, we hadn't really planned it, but as we had hoped, they were things we could get under control relatively quickly. But of course, it's not much fun when you realize that we're live now, there's no turning back. 99% work exactly as they should, but then there are still about 1 to 5% that don't work yet. And there are real users involved and real processes depend on them. And that has real consequences for employees, that is colleagues, or even for customers. And then, under time pressure, to say that the best thing I can do is to make sure it works in this new environment. And I think, at least for me, what I enjoyed, Chris, was the point of saying, I kind of hinted at it earlier, that we can do rolling deployments in the cloud. Oh, you just mentioned the Kubernetes technology. And we once said that's one item, one of our modernization topics was to say, we want to enable rolling deployments. And then we were in the situation where we said, we can't just have downtime every few hours. So we said, okay, now, then we'll just move this backlog item up and say we're doing rolling deployments now and hope that it works. And I honestly thoroughly enjoyed that.
That was fun, and it was also a learning experience that I took away from it. What I really wanted to say is, I think it's the most fun when you also have courage. And when you have the courage together to move forward and just try things out. And if you learn quickly enough and have a good team together if you can manage most of the eventualities that come your way somehow, then you should use that as an opportunity to be courageous. I think that's really important. And then it's also fun.
Wonderful closing words, both of you. Thank you very much for this exciting conversation to Chris from LPS and Dominik from Miles & More.
Thank you. That was really a lot of fun.
I can only agree with that. Thank you for having us here and for letting me be here.
And with that, I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you again to a new episode of Cloud Horizonte, the AWS podcast in German.
I had to use or implement Plan B, but